Find the domain of the function. When we are describing the domain, we are describing the possible values for x. We are saying what is x allowed to be in this function. And there are two main situations where we need to be careful with our domain. And that is if there is a fraction with a variable x in the denominator, like what we have here, we have to exclude values from the domain that would make the denominator 0, because it's not allowed to have a denominator of 0. We can't divide by 0. The other situation is if there is a square root, which we don't have in this problem, but if we had a square root of a quantity, we would have to exclude any x value that would result in the square root, in us doing the square root of a negative number, which would make it imaginary. Domain is always talking about keeping our function values in the real number system. So in this case, we are just looking at any x values that would make our denominator 0. So we're going to set our denominator equal to 0 and solve for x, and then those will be the values that we exclude. There are a couple of ways we can think about this, so I want to show you both ways. First, there is one more step of factoring we could do with the x squared minus 64. So it's actually a difference of squares. We can factor it into x plus 8 times x minus 8. So now that we have these three factors shown being multiplied together, if they're equal to 0, we can say that there's three possible solutions found by setting each factor equal to 0 and solving each one for x if needed. So the first possibility, we just have x equals 0, so that one's done. For this one, we would have to subtract 8 from both sides, so we get another solution, negative 8. And the last one, we would have to add 8 to both sides, giving us our last solution of positive 8. So these are the three solutions to this equation, solving it when it's set equal to 0. So that means that these are the x values that must be excluded from our domain. If x is equal to 0, the denominator is 0. If x was negative 8, the denominator is 0. If x is positive 8, the denominator is 0. So all of these x values are not allowed. So when we're describing the domain, we could say it is all real numbers. This is the real number symbol, except for these values. So we can say x cannot be 0, x cannot be 8, x cannot be negative 8. Now another way that we might have found these from the very beginning, if you didn't want to take the step of factoring that as a difference of squares, you could have just set each factor equal to 0 right here. So to solve this one, we would need to add 64 to both sides, but then we want to be really careful. So to solve for x, we would need to square root both sides. When we do a square root, we always have to put the plus or minus out in front, so that's how we get those two answers of 8 and negative 8.